Everyone assumes Mirkwood went dark the way a room goes dark when the lights go out, suddenly, passively, without intention. But what if that's completely wrong? What if the darkness in Mirkwood wasn't something that arrived, but something that was planted, carefully, deliberately, by a mind so ancient it measured time in centuries the way we measure it in minutes? Because here's the thing nobody talks about. The creatures that haunt those trees, the ones that web the canopy, that press against your mind, that watch you from places you can't quite see, they didn't evolve there. They didn't migrate there. They weren't born in some random accident of a world growing wild and dangerous. They were drawn there, like moths to a flame so dark it swallowed the light entirely. And once you understand why, the forest stops being a scary place in a fantasy story. It becomes something far more unsettling. It becomes evidence. Think about the moment Gandalf speaks about Mirkwood. Really think about it. This is a man, a being who has walked Middle-earth for thousands of years, who has stood in the ruins of the First Age, who has spoken with the last survivors of civilizations we have no name for. He doesn't rattle easily. He doesn't warn without reason. And yet, Mirkwood. There's something in the way it sits in his mouth. Not dread, exactly. Something quieter than dread. Something more like recognition. The way a doctor looks at an X-ray and goes very still, very calm, and you know the news isn't good. Why? Because Gandalf understands something the characters around him don't, something most readers skip right over. The danger in Mirkwood isn't the kind you can fight. It's not an army you can outmaneuver, or a puzzle you can solve. It's deeper than that, more intimate. The shadow creatures aren't guardians. They aren't random wilderness hazards. They are symptoms of something so profoundly wrong, it reshaped an entire living ecosystem from the inside out. And the disease that caused them? It had a name, it had a face, and it had been there, breathing quietly in the dark, for over 1,000 years before anyone thought to look. To understand where these creatures came from, you have to first understand something about how evil actually works in Tolkien's world. Because it doesn't work the way most people think. We tend to imagine evil as chaos, as destruction, as something that tears things apart. But in Tolkien's mythology, real evil, the deep kind, the ancient kind, doesn't destroy. It redirects. It takes something that was moving toward light and bends it, slowly, toward shadow. It's not a wrecking ball. It's a long, cold hand on the steering wheel. The first Dark Lord, Morgoth, couldn't actually create anything. That's crucial. He had no power of origination. What he had, what he was terrifyingly gifted at, was inversion. He took elves, the most beautiful of living creatures, and through processes so horrific Tolkien never fully described them, he unspun them, remade them, turned them into orcs. He took divine spirits, beings of the same order as Gandalf, and corrupted them across centuries into the Balrogs, the werewolves, the great ravening things of the First Age. He didn't make monsters, he manufactured them from miracles. Think of it like someone who takes a great painting and doesn't burn it. That would be too easy, too obvious, but instead makes tiny, precise alterations, changes the colors by a degree, shifts the angles slightly, does it so gradually, over so many years, that by the time you step back and look at the whole canvas, you can't quite point to the moment it stopped being beautiful. It just became something else. That's the template. That's the method. And Sauron, Morgoth's greatest student, his most gifted apprentice, didn't just learn that method. He perfected it.
Here's the thing about Sauron that most people fundamentally misunderstand. Before he fell, before he became the Eye, before the rings, before all of it, he was a craftsman, a divine craftsman, a Maya in service to Aule, the builder of the physical world. He understood, at a level most beings never could, how things are made, the joints, the seams, the principles underneath the principles. When someone like that turns to darkness, they don't become mindlessly destructive. They become surgically precise. And what he did to Mirkwood, What he was doing at Dol Guldur for over a millennium wasn't an attack, it was a procedure. The forest had a name once, Greenwood the Great, and that name wasn't poetic sentiment, it was just accurate. One of the oldest, most magnificent forests in the world. Sylvan elves lived in those trees, sang in those branches, in a place where the light came through the canopy like something sacred. Then, around the year 1050 of the Third Age, something settled in the south. Something quiet, something that didn't announce itself. A shadow. Small at first, easy to dismiss.
Animals drifted away from the southern reaches. Then the southern reaches began to spread, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way damp spreads through old stone. You don't see it moving. You just notice one morning that the wall is darker than it was, and then one morning it's darker still. And here is the mechanism nobody fully grasps. In Tolkien's world, a being of great spiritual power doesn't just inhabit a place, they alter it. Their nature radiates outward and rewrites the landscape around them. When the Witch King ruled Angmar, the North didn't just become politically dangerous, it became atmospherically wrong. When a Balrog slept beneath Moria across thousands of years, the darkness underground deepened in a way that had nothing to do with geology. Sauron at Dol Guldur was doing precisely this, for centuries, sitting in that ruin, half recovering his strength, and in the meantime, exhaling, just exhaling. And Mirkwood breathed him in. The shadow creatures, they are what happens when a living world has been breathing in corruption for so long that the corruption becomes indistinguishable from the air itself. Now follow this to where it actually leads, because the further you go, the colder it gets. The great spiders of Mirkwood, the ones that nearly kill the dwarves, the ones that trap and wrap and wait with that horrible patience, they aren't giant bugs that got lucky in a dark forest. Their bloodline goes back to Ungoliant, a being so primordial, so purely oriented toward consuming light, that Morgoth himself, the first Dark Lord, the being who scarred the foundations of the world, was afraid of her. Ungoliant didn't just live in darkness, she produced it. She consumed light and exhaled shadow as a byproduct. She was anti-creation given a body and an appetite. Her descendants scattered across the ages, looking for places where they could be what they were without resistance. And Mirkwood, under 1,000 years of Sauron's influence, had become exactly that. A place where their nature wasn't just tolerated, it was nourished. The shadow that permeated the forest and the shadow these creatures were made of were at some fundamental level the same substance. They didn't invade Mirkwood, they came home. But the spiders are only the most visible part of it.
Think about what the forest does to travelers. It's not just physically dangerous, it's psychologically predatory. The darkness presses on the mind. Fire catches poorly. Water enchants and sedates. The road shifts beneath your feet even when you're watching it. Bomber falls into a stream and sleeps for days, dreaming of banquet tables while his companions slowly starve. The whole company loses their direction inside a forest they're walking through on a path. That's not a natural forest. That's a designed environment, a trap at ecosystem scale. Sauron didn't station guards along the road through Mirkwood. He didn't need to issue orders. He had saturated the landscape so deeply, so thoroughly with his own will and nature, that the landscape itself enforced his intentions. The trees weren't evil, but the shadow between them served him. The water wasn't poisoned, but its enchantment served him. The spiders weren't receiving commands, but their hunger served him perfectly. He had outsourced his cruelty to the world itself. And that right there, is a more terrifying kind of power than any fortress, any army, any great weapon. Because you can break a fortress, you can defeat an army, you can unmake a weapon. But how do you fight a forest?
Let's go to the deepest level now, the part that doesn't leave you easily. The shadow creatures of Mirkwood are not evil because they chose it. That distinction matters enormously. The Nazgul chose. They traded freedom for power and are now paying an eternal price in chains of their own making. Sauron chose, in full knowledge, with full understanding of what he was walking away from. Even Morgoth chose, in the music of creation itself, to disrupt rather than harmonize. Choice is at least legible. Choice you can understand, even if it horrifies you. But the spiders of Mirkwood don't know what they are. The presences in the dark don't remember a time when these trees rang with elvish voices. The enchantment on the water has no awareness that it serves a broken will recovering in a ruin to the south. They simply are what they are, and what they are was made for them, constructed around them, over centuries, the way a river carves a canyon, not through violence, but through sheer, patient, unrelenting persistence. This is the truth that makes Mirkwood genuinely disturbing. Not the spiders, not the darkness, the process.
Sauron at Dol Guldur wasn't hiding, not primarily. He was demonstrating, proving to himself, to any power wise enough to recognize it, that he could take something ancient and magnificent and metabolize it, not conquer it, digest it, transform it from the inside so slowly and so completely that at no single moment could you point to the line where Greenwood the Great became Mirkwood. It just became. And if he could do that to a forest, what could he do to a people who invited him to sit at their table? The One Ring is famous. The rings of power are legendary. But Mirkwood is the proof of concept, the quiet demonstration that came before the grand design, the sketch before the masterpiece. He didn't need the ring to corrupt Mirkwood. He didn't need armies or artifice or even conscious effort toward the end. He just needed time and presence. That should terrify us more than any dark tower ever could.
There's a word that theologians and philosophers have used for centuries to describe exactly what Sauron does. Not destruction, corruption. And in its oldest, truest meaning, corruption doesn't mean simple rot. It means transformation through the slow removal of essence, a thing that keeps its shape while losing its soul. Mirkwood is still a forest. That's the point. The trees stand, the rivers run, the paths exist. Nothing has been demolished. The architecture of something living is completely intact. But the meaning has been inverted. A forest is supposed to shelter. Mirkwood traps. A forest is supposed to nourish. Mirkwood sedates and disorients and feeds you to things waiting in the canopy. Every function preserved, every purpose reversed. Tolkien, who was Catholic in the deepest and most intellectual sense, understood evil not as the opposite of good, but as the absence of good in something built to contain it, a hole in the shape of something sacred. And the creatures of Mirkwood embody that perfectly. They are not evil things. They are good things emptied out and refilled. Creatures whose natures, hunting, surviving, building, following instinct toward life, have been hollowed and poured back full of shadow. They live. They are real. They are, in some painful sense, innocent of what they became. And here is where the story becomes genuinely sad, underneath all the darkness. The traveler who enters Mirkwood and feels their mind beginning to slip, feels the path softening under them, feels the fire dying and the darkness pressing closer. That traveler is experiencing the same thing the forest experienced. The shadow is tasting them, learning their edges, testing whether they too might be slowly unmade and remade into something that serves the dark. Most people escape. The forest releases them, changed, shaken, but intact. But some, in the older histories, didn't come back. And we don't know what happened to them. We only know the forest got darker.
The creatures didn't heal. The spiders didn't transform back into something gentle. The presences in the shadow didn't suddenly remember being part of something beautiful. They retreated. They diminished. They became less than what the darkness had made them. But they didn't become anything else. The forest could be renamed. The elves could return. The green could come back to the leaves. But the things the shadow had made over 3,000 years,
They simply faded, shrank, drifted to the margins of a world that no longer sustained them. They didn't recover. They just receded. And somehow, that quiet fact disturbs me more than anything else in this story. The forest got its name back. The creatures got nothing. They were made by something that used them and never once considered what they were for, other than that. That's not a horror story. That's something older than horror. That's just how certain kinds of darkness work.
Mirkwood was healed eventually. After the War of the Ring, after the shadow finally broke and the long age of Sauron ended, the forest was renamed Erin Lasgallen, the Wood of Green Leaves. The elves returned to the trees. The light filtered through again. The spiders retreated to whatever edge of the world still wanted them. It sounds like a happy ending. But I keep coming back to one number. One quiet, brutal number. 3,000 years. 3,000 years of accumulated shadow before the healing could begin. 3,000 years of creatures shaped by a darkness they never questioned because it was the only nature they had ever known. 3,000 years of a forest so thoroughly rewritten that it forgot the name it was born with. And what finally broke it wasn't an army or a hero or even a great act of courage in Mirkwood itself. What broke it was the destruction of the One Ring, the total unraveling of Sauron's concentrated will, the annihilation of the central engine that had been running, quietly, underneath everything, for an age of the world. Only then did the forest remember how to breathe differently. But here's the thing I can't shake. The thing that lingers.
But here's what keeps pulling at the edge of this story. If Sauron could corrupt an entire ancient forest through presence alone, through simply existing in proximity to something good, then what exactly did he do to the men of Numenor? Because that wasn't a forest. That was the greatest civilization humanity ever built. A people gifted with lifespans that stretched towards centuries, who could see Valinor on the horizon on clear days, who crossed the known world in fleets that made every other seafaring nation look like children with toy boats. And Sauron walked into their court, not as a conqueror, not with armies or fire or shadow. He walked in as a counselor, quiet, brilliant, ingratiating. He sat at their table, he spoke in their councils, and he exhaled. How long before they couldn't tell his voice from their own thoughts? How long before the greatest civilization in human history became, in some fundamental, irreversible way, Mirkwood in the shape of a kingdom? That story is darker than anything we've covered today, deeper, more personal. And it's the one we're going into next.